Thanks everyone for joining us. I hope we're going to have a really fascinating conversation for the next 55 minutes. I have a distinguished group of panelists joining me. I mean, I'm just a professional nerd. We have people who actually know something about vaccines, something about vaccine trials from various angles. The panelists are Professor Sir Andrew Pollard, who's director of the Oxford Vaccine Group, Professor of Pediatric Infection and Immunity, Chief Investigator for the clinical trials of the Oxford vaccine, now sometimes known as the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. He was knighted in the New Year's Honours List. I know basically no prizes for guessing what he was knighted for. Fran Monks, who is a portrait photographer who specializes in celebrating the under-celebrated. Her portraits are in the collections of the Science Museum in London, the National Portrait Gallery. If you're in Oxford, they're in the Ashmolean Museum, or one of them is. There are portraits up on the outside of the Blavatnik School of Government, up on the hoardings outside the old Boswell site, but most importantly, portraits of vaccine trial participants are currently being exhibited inside the History of Science Museum. So if you are local, please go and take a look. And that is all part of the Photo Oxford Festival. We'll also be joined by Dr. Helen Solstree, who was a wonderful contributor to my BBC show, How to Vaccinate the World. She is a local GP. She is also a vaccine trial volunteer featured in Fran's portraits, and a senior medical education fellow at the Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences at Oxford University, and Silke Ackermann of the History of Science Museum. Dr. Ackermann will also be joining us. But let me start by inviting Professor Pollard, Andy Pollard, to join me, and we'll talk for about 15 minutes, then we'll hear from Fran, and then we'll have a more general conversation. So hello, can I call you Andy? Do I have to call you Professor Sir Pollard?
Oh, you can call me anything you like, but Andy is fine.
Okay, I always wind up David Spiegelhalter, who's a esteemed statistician who I know quite well by calling him Professor Sir David at every possible opportunity. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure you're busy. I'm particularly interested this evening in the trial process, the clinical trial process of developing a vaccine, because I think a lot of people, they have in mind, oh, it must be hard to make a vaccine, and then to invent one, to develop one, and then it's hard to manufacture them and get them into people's arms. But there's also this process in the middle that I think is already receding in our memories of showing that they're safe and showing that they work, the trials. So what was it like knowing that you had a candidate vaccine and then trying to set up the clinical trials? What's that process like?
Well, actually, the first bit of the process is waiting for information. First of all, the vaccine is being made. We have to prove that it is sufficient quality to actually be used in humans, and that's a very highly regulated process. So we're waiting for all these release tests to come back from the manufacturing process to show that what's made can actually be put into humans, and we actually got those results all back just 24 hours before we were ready to start the trial. And also there's very extensive testing undertaken in animal studies, which come before the trials start to show safety, and also in our case to show the vaccine provided protection, all of which then set us up extremely well for those first conversations that you have when you start the trials with the trial volunteers. And just backing up a bit, that in setting up the trial, there's a lot of head scratching goes on about what the right design of the protocol is. And of course, in the context of the pandemic, we were designing the trial in the face of the first wave of coronavirus back in February last year, with the modeling predicting hundreds of thousands of people dying. And so we were thinking, how could we very rapidly deliver the trial so that we might be in a position to save lives as early as possible? And that was particularly relevant when you think that through much of last year, globally, 10,000 people were dying every day. So it felt like an enormous pressure to first of all get started, which we had to wait for those processes, but also then to think about the best designs that might allow us to get there as quickly as possible.
I mean, how is it that you do think through those designs? Because I mean, at the moment we're now talking about, oh, actually we need some boosters. You had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that was a 1-dose vaccine. Your vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine, and most of the other vaccines are 2 doses. And now we're like, actually, maybe 3 doses, but we didn't get to try a 3rd dose in the original trials because there wasn't time. With this, it's a completely new disease. It's a completely new vaccine. How do you decide, oh, we're going to try 1 dose, or we're going to do 2 doses? We'll have a 3-week break. We'll have a 3-month break. What goes into that sort of decision making?
Well, it isn't actually a completely new vaccine, in that we already had coronavirus vaccines for other coronaviruses that were being developed here in Oxford. And we actually set off as a 1-dose vaccine. And the reason for that was because of this huge wave of disease. And it just seemed implausible that you could get a 2nd dose in before lots of people had got the disease. So the initial thinking was as a 1-dose vaccine. And so the first participants, we enrolled with giving them 1 dose with that intention, exactly like Johnson & Johnson did. But we also embedded within the trial, because we asked lots of questions in that first trial, we embedded within it a 2-dose group to see if 2 doses were better. And of course, by the time we got the results of the trial, lockdowns had happened, the virus was very much had been chased away. And we realized there was time to get the optimal immune response, which is 2 doses, rather than stick with the 1 dose. And so we then pivoted, and in the way that's very easy in an academic setting, to pivot to a 2-dose program, and then move through the later phases of the trials with 2 doses.
And forgive me, because I know this is very basic for you, but I think it'll be new to a lot of people. Just talk us through. You've got these phase 1, you've got phase 2, you've got phase 3. Sometimes I hear about phase 4 or stage 4 trials. What's being done at different stages?
Well, the phase 1 trial is being undertaken to, first of all, see whether there's any real concerns about the use of a vaccine, to also to work out what doses might be optimal. In this case, we already knew that from previous work with this type of vaccine. And you might also, in those studies, look at whether you need to add things to the vaccine in order to suit them up a bit. So the phase 1 is trying to test the water, see, get some initial information about safety, and see whether you've optimized the immune response. Phase 2 then tends to be a slightly larger study of safety in the target population. And in our case, phase 2 was the elderly, because that was the key target population. That's where most of the severe disease and deaths were. And then phase 3 is huge trials to prove that the vaccine works. So that's the phases. Phase 1, testing the water. Phase 2, trying to get a bit more data in the target group. And then phase 3, proving that the vaccine works. Phase 4 is something which is done after licensure. And we're really in the phase 4 world at the moment in the UK, with lots of studies going on to try and work out what to do next. Do we need boosters? How long does immunity last? That's the phase 4 studies that are going on currently. And it's interesting when you come back to that initial step with phase 1 in the pandemic, and because you don't really know very much about the vaccine, we had to say to our trial volunteers, we don't know if this vaccine's safe or if it will work. And yet we knew, and I think the public knew, that people really needed to take part in vaccine studies in order to help get us out of the pandemic. And tens of thousands of people came forward to take part. And unusually, recruitment was not a problem at all. People were so willing to come and help to really save the whole world.
Yeah, it is a remarkable act, I think, and we'll be exploring that some more as the evening goes on. I'm particularly interested in the people who volunteer for that first phase, because by the time you're in the phase 3, it's been injected into a few hundred people, and it seems fine. So there might still be some risks, and it might be a bit of a dud. You might be spending time and effort and being swabbed a lot and jabbed a lot, and you don't get anything out of it. But the phase 1 people, the first person to have that thing injected into them, I mean, it feels like that. I mean, maybe I'm over Hollywoodizing the whole thing, but that feels like a big moment that everybody must have had their hearts in their mouths at that point.
Well, I actually don't think that is the case. I mean, we were going, from our perspective, into phase 1 with a known technology, with a vaccine very similar to ones that had already been tested. And so I think we had reasonable confidence in safety. What we didn't have certainty about is how well the vaccine would work or not. And so the safety side wasn't so worrying. For the public who are taking part, it is interesting that a lot of the phase 1 people who came forwards tended to be people who had some scientific understanding. They were either scientists or some of them were healthcare workers. So we did, in that initial phase, definitely attract people who probably would have had some further insight into the fact that this was going to be fine for them to participate in these initial studies. But nevertheless, it is a big step for people to take, to be the first person to be vaccinated.
And was it hard to reach any particular kind of group for the trial? You found, oh, we haven't got enough old people, we haven't got enough young people, or you mentioned that scientists were the ones, or people with medical training, they were the ones coming forward at first. Did you find yourself having to reach out and try and target particular groups to step forward?
Well, I didn't say, but phase 1 trials are focused on healthy volunteers. So actually, we had to exclude lots of people in the phase 1 who wanted to take part, because from a regulatory point of view, that has to be defined as a healthy younger population. As we moved towards phase 3, we essentially took all comers, because that's really important to have data across the whole of society as early as possible. But we did, despite that, try and focus a bit towards people who are likely to be at a higher risk of infection. Because again, if you go to people at low risk of infection, you then end up with taking much longer to get an answer. So we'd had a lot of healthcare workers actually in the phase 3 trials as a result of that. We didn't have any particular problem recruiting any age group. One of the myths about the trials is that we didn't recruit enough old people in our trials. But actually, it wasn't that there weren't enough old people. It was that our safety monitoring board felt that it would be prudent in the phase 3 trials and the phase 2 trials to recruit the older adults a bit later. So we actually had our answer in younger adults a long time before we got enough data in older adults, who also were much more cautious than young adults and were less likely to get infected in the first place. So I think the issue really, we had no trouble with any population in getting people to come forward. Everyone wanted to take part, which was incredibly humbling for us.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I'm curious as to whether it was anything that with hindsight could have been done more quickly or could have been done differently. You mentioned 10,000 people a day were dying. Tremendous pressure to get everything done as quickly as possible. Is there something that now you think, oh, if only we'd done it like that, we would have been able to do it quicker, or we would have got a better answer? Have we learned anything?
Well, I think the one key thing that allows you to get there quicker is to go bigger. And we recruited about 25,000 people across 3 continents into the trials in a very short period of time. And that was more or less the capacity of what we could safely manage at that time. But we probably could have gone bigger. We just would have had to get a few more staff to help support those trials. But if we had done that, we would not have had the doses to vaccinate them. And I think this is a key problem that was facing us in 2020. There just wasn't the manufacturing for large-scale production for trials. And so we manufactured some. In Oxford, we can make about 1,000 doses at a time, which is a very small trial. We had to get further doses from a manufacturing company in Italy, which caused additional headaches of shipping those over rapidly enough with such fast recruiting trials. And then eventually, when AstraZeneca came on board, we had larger manufacturing here in the UK as well. But it was actually manufacturing capacity early which hindered us, and I couldn't change that. I think in the future, I hope the UK will be in a better position that we could go bigger earlier, because then you can shave off possibly even months from getting the readout, and that is a lot of lives saved if you can do that. Yeah,
I keep being told by experts that it was all done incredibly quickly and this is all unprecedented. But of course, we're always asking ourselves, could we have done even better next time? So you mentioned the future. So What are you and your colleagues now working on? Is it newer, better COVID vaccines, or have you got your eyes on other diseases?
Well, COVID, as you may have noticed, hasn't gone away yet.
I've noticed.
So there is still a lot of work to do. We have work going on looking at different types of COVID vaccines. Also, there's a huge program led from within the team here in Oxford looking at mix and match schedules, working on booster studies. So all of this data generation continues both here and in fact in our sites in other countries to better understand how we can protect people in the long run going into the future. But we do have to also restart projects that have been put on hold because there are other diseases which affect people all across the planet. And we really want to be in a position to help them as well. I think there is also this really important need today to think about preparing for future pandemics. I think we were much better prepared for this one than we would have been even 5 or 6 years ago because of government investment from 2015 on the back of Ebola into pandemic preparedness. But I think this is a wake-up call for us for the next time. We're actually dealing with a pretty limp virus and that it's killing less than 1% of people. If this had been one of the other coronaviruses like MERS, which was a virus which emerged about 10 years ago, that killed a third of the people who were infected. So we've actually been quite fortunate, and it really is a wake-up call. We need to be much better prepared next time. All those structural things we've talked about, but the science that goes behind that, so that just like this time, we know what to do when it comes. If it was some other diseases, we would not know how to start, and we may need 1 or 2 years just of the science to get us to the starting gun.
And to what extent is it possible to prepare in a generic way to produce a vaccine versus obviously there's certain things you can only do once you see the virus, the pathogen that you're dealing with?
I think we can do a lot more than has been done to prepare for the future. The reason for why coronavirus vaccines have gone so well is because we had worked on vaccines in that family. But there are lots of other families of viruses where people have not studied them at all about how they might be prevented if there was a pandemic. So I do think we can do generic work on different types of families of viruses and bacteria that could be pandemic threats, which would prepare us better. But we also have platform technologies. So everyone's very familiar now with the RNA vaccines that Pfizer and Moderna have made, the viral vectors. But there are lots of other platforms. There's about 10 different types of platforms that we already use in vaccines. And those technologies, different ones will work well for different types of diseases. And so that combination of the platforms and also knowing which bit of the virus or bacterium to put into them means that we should be better prepared for next time, as long as we do the work over the years ahead.
Well, let's hope so. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. Please stay with us if you can. But I wanted to hand over to Fran Monks, because we talked about the vaccine trials, we've talked about the participants in the vaccine trials. And Fran Monks is a photographer who has been taking quite unusual portraits of those vaccine trial participants. So Fran, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks very much, Andy. It was so interesting to hear your perspective on the trials, having met so many of the trial participants while making these portraits. So I'm actually going to show some pictures. Hopefully that will work. There we go. So I wanted to start with talking briefly about how I came to make portraits via Zoom. And this is Ricky. Ricky lives in Melbourne, Australia, and I met her in March 2020 by FaceTime. She has been bedbound, though those are her choice of words, for 20 years. And when I spoke to her in 2020, she said she hadn't really left the house for 3 years. And before that, it was just an occasional trip in the wheelchair. And she came to me because I had put out a note on Twitter asking if people would be willing to be photographed on Zoom. And we linked up, and as you can see, it was quite pixelated. The broadband wasn't great. The sound wasn't great either. But it was amazing to make this connection with her, because if in any other circumstance, I wouldn't have been able to meet her or chat with her, and the pandemic had made this possible. And she told me about her life and about how she lived with a flatmate, and how he sort of helped her out with chores, and she had carers visiting a couple of times a week. She couldn't work, but she runs a Facebook group that helps people with the technology that she uses to communicate. And I just realized, wow, I can take these portraits and I can tell the stories of people that would otherwise be completely hidden. And she also was really excited that because of what was starting to happen with the pandemic, she felt that she could participate and opportunities were coming up for her. And so it felt like a really positive connection. And also the other side of this picture is that I was at home, a portrait photographer who could no longer go out and do my job. I had my 3 children at home who were homeschooling and needed looking after. And yet by using Zoom, I could still do my job. And that's how it all started. So in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you more about how I came to be photographing vaccine trial participants by Zoom. But I just want to talk a little bit more, first of all, about how I made the Zoom photography work. So this is another portrait that I took back in March 2020. Abby's actually a neighbour of mine, and so it was new to us that we couldn't go and meet for a coffee and that we had to connect this way. But I think that her portrait was the first one that I looked at and I thought, okay, this is something visually really interesting. And even though we've all got much better now at making ourselves look, you know, decent on Zoom, I think you would agree that this is not a typical Zoom picture that you see when you link up with someone that way. So what do I do in order to make this happen? Well, I think you can tell that she's back from the camera. And that was something that I realized was you could make a much more interesting portrait by moving the subject back from the camera. Sometimes there's someone around to help with that. Sometimes you just have to balance the laptop or the phone or the iPad on a shelf or a you know, table, whatever's around. In the case of Abby, we had her 8-year-old son holding the iPad. I realized that rather than just moving the camera myself, I had to really explain what I wanted, which is a totally different experience for a photographer. And I can remember explaining to the boy that, you know, I really wanted that picture above Abby's head to be completely in the frame, and I wanted the lamp in the frame. And he was really good. He moved the iPad around so that I could make the picture. And then I decided not to take a screenshot. What I did is photograph the screen. And I realized that when I photograph the screen, you get all these interesting effects happening. So you can see the sort of grid across the front of the image, hopefully. And that's something called moire, which is where the sensor in the camera is interacting with the screen, and it kind of starts to make these grid effects. Because I wanted to show that this was an image that was made through many, many digital layers. I wasn't trying to imitate the act of actually being in the room with Abby. The other thing that I found interesting was the little, hopefully you can see it, picture of myself up in the corner, because as any portrait photographer knows, any portrait is in many ways a reflection of the person who's making the portrait. And so this sort of image, this little thumbnail in the corner that's in all of my Zoom portraits kind of makes that explicit, that there are 2 people involved in making this picture, and there I am up in the corner, and it's like my own little signature. And the other one final thing that I wanted to mention about how these portraits work is I always try and make a portrait of someone in their own environment, and I like to make portraits in people's homes or in their workplaces, because people are more relaxed that way, and it says more about the person. But in this case, I'm in their space, but I'm not actually really in their space. And I find that this actually makes people much more at ease. So it's a great way of allowing someone to be in control of their own space and really, I think, capturing something interesting. So having worked out that this technique worked, I started to capture some of the experiences of the pandemic. So people in their closed restaurants. This was an opera singer who all his gigs had been cancelled. People who were going through life-changing moments like having their first child, suffering from cancer, people who were isolating on canal boats, people who weren't isolating at all. So this is a doctor about to go into ICU to look after COVID patients. I was able to travel virtually all around the world making portraits. So this lady's in Spain, this one's in India. I spoke to someone in Sweden. They were having quite a different experience of the pandemic from us. In Ireland, a priest in Ireland. This person's in Colombia. I partnered with Huddersfield University and we started photographing mothers who were homeschooling, and they were doing research trying to understand the impact of the pandemic on these mothers. And I did the portraits to go along with that research. I photographed scientists in the US who'd been pushed out of the federal government by the Trump administration. And I even did some landscape photography. I traveled around the world, people pointed their cameras at the view that they had, and I was able to make pictures that way. So it was a really fascinating way to capture portraits and also record this historic time that was happening. So by this point, I'd done nearly 100 pictures, and it was towards the end of 2020. And as a photographer, as Tim mentioned, I always want to celebrate the under-celebrated. And I started thinking about who were really the under-celebrated at that moment in the pandemic. We were all waiting for the vaccine. And I was based in Oxford and knew a few people who were on the trials. And I realized that these were people who were so crucial to all of us getting out of the situation that we were in more quickly. And so I decided that I wanted to start photographing some of the vaccine trial participants. So as is always the case with these kind of projects, I started with a friend, and this is Fee. She was one of the first 20 people who took part in the Oxford vaccine trial. She told me about how when her dad was really ill, he'd needed lots of blood transfusions. And as a result of that experience, she had become a regular blood donor. And then for her, when she heard about the need for vaccine trial participants, she thought this was, the next step. It seemed like an obvious step to her. She said the only hesitation that she had was that she had 2 children and she didn't want them to be without a mother, but she really wasn't concerned about that too much. She felt very confident going into the trial, and so that's what she did. And then once I'd got this picture, I was able to post on social media and start asking other people if they would be willing to come forward, because of all the understandable privacy around the trials. I couldn't go to Andrew and say, oh, please, can you give me a list of your vaccine trial participants? I had to find them myself. So I went out and I advertised on social media, and I also looked at other articles that had been written about vaccine trials. There were not that many about the actual people, but Connie came forward. So Connie lives in California. She's actually, she was on one of the other trials, on the Pfizer trial. She had been a school bus driver for 25 years and she'd just retired. And although she said all her family were opposed to the idea, she was adamant she wanted to do this and she wanted to be on the trial. Her family are really important to her. You can see they're all pictured behind her. And she said, actually, I am doing it for them, even though they're not so sure. And she was the only one of the people that I spoke to who had been on a trial previously. she had been on a vaccine trial for valley fever in the 1980s, because this was an illness that her husband had suffered from. And in fact, that trial did not manage to create a successful vaccine. So she said she was particularly delighted that her second attempt at being on a trial had been much more successful. She described how she drove 2.5 hours to the testing centre in order to participate in the trial, and that she said it was so thorough that she had the medical files that she had were thicker than her entire life's worth of medical files. So yeah, she felt very confident with how she's been looked after. I must say that everyone that I spoke to 31 trial participants in the end on 5 different trials, and they were all very positive about their experiences. So this is another participant. This is Shawn. He's not actually in the exhibition in the History of Science Museum, but I really wanted to tell his story because I found him particularly impressive. So Shawn said he was really interested in the virus, and so he'd read so much that he had become really anxious, and he was having nightmares about the virus. And then he saw an advertisement for the trial, and he thought, actually, this is how I'm going to respond to these feelings of anxiety. And so very bravely, I think, he set forward and signed up for the trial. And he also is a type 2 diabetic. And he said that that actually meant that they were quite keen. I think this reflected something that Andrew said, actually. They were quite keen to have him on the trial because he was young, but he also had this additional risk factor. So yeah, so that was Shawn, who I think was particularly brave. And then this is Neil, and this actually, Neil's story also reflects something that Andrew said. So Neil was on the Imperial trial, on the phase 1 trial, but he's a radiologist, so he was a medical worker with some knowledge of how the vaccines worked. And he wanted to be on the trial because his husband was a heart transplant patient, and he saw this as an opportunity to hopefully get some kind of vaccination early and therefore protect his husband. And then this is Lance, and Lance is a chemistry professor in the US, and he was very conscious that in the African American community in the US, there's quite a bit of vaccine hesitancy. And so he felt as someone who really understood the science, he wanted to participate on the trial so that he could then act as an advocate within his community. He actually went to be screened for the Moderna vaccine, and they discovered during the screening that he had hypertension. And so he said that he took all the medication that he was prescribed and got the hypertension under control. And then, you know, clearly very determined, went back and became a participant on the Novavax trial. So he achieved his aim in the end. Really impressive. So as I said, I spoke to in total 31 vaccine trial participants. Each one of them had a really interesting story about why they had chosen to step forward in this way. So please do go to the museum and have a look at more, and you can see their stories there, or you can see them on my website, or there are some also on the side of what was, if you're in Oxford, the Boswell's building. There are some up there as well. And if you are interested in other people who are fighting against a global crisis behind the scenes, I also have these portraits of climate change negotiators, which are on my website, but also on the side of the Blavatnik building. So please do pop along there if you're interested. So I'm still doing the Zoom photography, and I hope that it's something that I'll be able to continue with into the future. And then I'm just going to leave this picture here while Tim introduces Helen Solstree, our next guest, because she is a vaccine trial participant and also put herself in front of my camera. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran. And yes, lovely photograph of Helen, who is complaining about the fact that she's less well lit in her GP's surgery than she is in Fran's photograph, but that's the way things are. Thank you again, Fran. Stay with us. By the way, if people have questions for Fran, for Professor Pollard, for any of our panelists, do send them in. We won't have long, but we'll have a few minutes at the end of the hour to try to get to some of your questions. So Helen, Dr. Solstree, thank you for joining us. I understand you've got more doctoring to do later this evening. You've been doctoring all day. And so thank you so much. So great that you took a break from being a doctor to be a trial participant. What motivated that?
I'm perennially curious. I always like to get involved with stuff. And I think there are probably three main motives. Well, maybe two main motives, but also a kind of a no reason not to. And the no reason not to is about trust and about understanding and about, recognizing that these guys up there developing the vaccines, they do know what they're doing. So I didn't have any hesitancy from that point of view. I had no worries that it might do me any harm, but some belief that it might do both me and other people some good. So there's the altruistic, I'd like to save the world and save my patients. And frankly, I was quite scared, having seen, I'm a bit of a Twitter addict. So having seen the pictures coming in from Italy, and just the disaster that was unfolding, and then seeing what was happening to people here, it was clear that we needed to do something fast. And if I could help in any way, that would be great. There has to be said, there was a bit of self-interest in there too, which is, I don't know whether I'm going to get the active compound or maybe I'll get the placebo, but I got a 50-50 chance of getting something that might help me not get COVID. So I guess there was a tiny bit of self-interest in being in the trial. Mostly it's about being a good citizen though.
Well, there was this mix, as I think Fran may have mentioned, the people that she interviewed, some of them were very much like, I need to contribute, I need to do something. And other people were like, I want that vaccine, so I'm going to...
I think we probably all had a bit of both. I mean, I think it's mostly wanting to help, but
possibly so. And how did you find out about the trials? Was it sort of the inside track in the Oxford healthcare community, or did you see it?
No, I don't think so. I'm trying to remember, but I think it was my usual source of information is Twitter. It could possibly have been something from Biobank. I don't know whether but anyway, it was either an email or it was a Twitter thing that said, would you like to, are you interested? And I'm always interested.
And what does it mean to you to be one of these people who is being portrayed as part of this series? So normally we take photographs of politicians and pop stars and endangered species. We don't normally see photographs of people in clinical trials.
I just think there's two things. There's the subjects, but there's also the method and the new kind of way of doing portraits that Fran's come up with, which I think is really interesting because it's something quite different, and I'm delighted to be part of that. You probably noticed I'm not the most self-effacing of people or the shyest of people. So there's a slight part of me that wonders whether I do want my face plastered over the whole of Oxford, or a bit of Oxford, but on the whole I don't mind. And I also, I suppose there's a little bit which also says kind of quite ordinary people like me were in this trial, so when there's another one, ordinary people like you can be in that as well. And I think that's also a kind of message to put out. All the variety of people that Fran's taken pictures of, they're all kind of people like you and me and anyone who might walk past and see them, which maybe is good to help other people join in next time. I'm sure there will be next time. There'll be lots of next times if Andy's right, and I'm afraid he probably is.
Yes, well, I get the impression we're not really through the this time, but there'll be next times as well. Yes. Well, thank you very much. please stay with us. Let me encourage you to send in questions for our panelists. Anybody can do that by typing in the Q&A box. But for now, let me hand over to Dr. Silke Ackermann, who is our host, really, who is the director of the History of Science Museum, where these portraits are currently on display. So, Silke, how do you see the role of the History of Science Museum in depicting what is not yet a historical event? It's still all too contemporary.
Well, precisely that is so exciting about it. How often are we part of history as it unfolds? And when we normally collect in hindsight, we know how things happened, we can look back at it, and we have a slightly detached view. But this one is something, the pandemic is something we are all part of. And for the museum, for us, it's so exciting to be able to tell those stories, not knowing yet what the objects are we're going to bring in. What the stories are we are going to tell. Andy, Fran and Helen have all said it's about people. Science can be something which appears quite detached, and there is a vaccine being developed and it's all very complex. But this is all about people. There are people here at the university who had started the process, but the pressure was enormous. To develop something which is going to help us to get to this pandemic. So we're interested, obviously, in the science, but also in what is the daily life for them, what happened, what were their frustrations, what did they do the moment they discovered they may have a breakthrough. So did they all go and had a bottle of champagne? No, we found out that they all went home and had a proper sleep. These are the stories we want to tell. And of course, the reaction to the pandemic on a daily life, in daily life, I think everybody recalls there weren't any masks at the beginning. So we have self-handmade masks in response in university, so we could protect each other. It is all really telling the stories of those who are part of this pandemic here at the university. Many names are well known now, but there are many people whose name will never be known, who have contributed hugely to finding a solution. For example, very innovative ventilators were developed, which most people will not be aware of. A whole group of researchers putting their research on hold to respond to the pandemic. And that is what we want to share with our audiences in future. So one can come back and find out, how did this actually work? What did people do? What are the objects that were created? A bottle of beer, which was brewed especially for the vaccine group. There's ephemera we're definitely going to have as well. Cards sent by a group of primary school children cheering on the vaccine group, saying we're so excited, we're so proud of you. But we're also asking our audiences, what are the stories you want to tell? So with the exhibition we have on at the moment, we are asking those who come on site and those who visit the exhibitions online, what stories would you tell? What is the story of the pandemic you want to share with others? And which objects should we collect? So this is this is the most audience involved collecting, displaying, sharing that we've ever done in our history.
And do you see this focus on people, and also the focus on beer, which I'm very happy to hear about and making me very thirsty? This focus on people, do you see that as a change of direction for the History of Science Museum? Because it has beautiful objects, but I never really thought of it as a people museum. Are you changing that, or was my initial impression wrong?
Well, your initial impression was very right, and that's precisely what we are aiming to change. Because all the objects we have on display were either made by somebody, well, they're always made by somebody, they're made for somebody, they were used as a status symbol or in a particular context. They were all meant to do something, and right now we have cases full of stuff which is very difficult to make sense of, and there's no person in there. So telling the stories behind these objects is really important. And part of our new mission statement is all about connecting and sharing the stories of people's science, art and belief. So people have the most important role in that. And of course, in the pandemic, or the pandemic was all about, I should probably say, all about people.
Well, thank you very much, Silke. I wanted to hand over to our audience, to you guys watching at home. Some of you have sent in some questions. I'm looking through some of them. So a question from Hugh Goider and Andy Pollard, if you're still there, I think possibly you're the person to answer this one. Hugh says, everyone's saying we'll get more pandemics in the future. You've said it, Helen said it. Is it possible to know when the next one will be, or how often they will come, or is it completely random?
I think it's a great question. I mean, of course, we don't know when the next one's going to come, and there isn't any modelling that's going to give an answer to that. I mean, I think the reason why there's increasing certainty of more pandemics relates to both the size of the population on the world, which is getting bigger, so that's more opportunity for new pathogens, viruses and bacteria to start their journey of transmitting in human populations. And then, of course, we have this amazing connectivity globally, which means that spread is more likely. You know, if we go back some millennia to a time when we were living in much smaller populations, an outbreak of a disease might wipe out a small village, but it would be much less likely to spread globally. But even by the Middle Ages, the density of humans in Europe was enough that when plague struck, it wiped out half of the population of Europe. And it took us another 100 years to recover the European population. And compared with today, the population was minuscule in the Middle Ages. So I think it's really, we've got the perfect environment, humans encroaching on animal habitats, lots of close interaction with wild animals as well as domestic species. And that's exactly where many of these threats will come from, which is why I think there's this increasing certainty. But whether it's next year or in 50 years or 100 years, I can't answer.
Thank you. I've got a question for Fran from someone who prefers to remain anonymous. The question is, how did your portrait subjects choose their locations or backgrounds? Did you play a role in that?
It depends very much how much time people have. Busy doctors like Helen may not have had much time for looking around the house. But if people have a bit of time, we look around, try and find the best lighting. Sometimes people have quite a firm idea about what they want, and then I have a job to persuade them to do what I want. It's usually really fun though. It's quite a collaborative process, much more than normal, because I have to really explain what I want. And I must say it's really quite special to pop up around the world, literally, and not know where you're going to find yourself and not having had that journey to get there. So one example with the climate change negotiators, I popped up and this person was in Malawi, and they were by the roadside because they were trying to get home to their home village, and they just got a passerby to hold the phone, and I photographed my screen, and I wonder what that passerby must have thought about what on earth the person from Oxford was doing. But yeah, it depends. You have to be adaptable.
I actually remember Fran making me wander around my house with my laptop. We did do a bit of that, wandering around, looking what it looked like in this place, looking what we settled on the kitchen. The light was nicest. I remember you carried me down the stairs, and it always feels so strange when people do that, but it happens quite often. Absolutely.
So another question, and this one is for everybody. Maybe let me ask Helen first, but I would like to get everyone's view on the panel. Who are the other unsung heroes in science and technology? If you could pitch another group of people for Fran to photograph, who would it be? Helen?
That's interesting. The science and the technology. bit, because when Unsung Heroes, when I'm going to do that, I was going to say it should be the care workers, but I know the science and technology, they're the pandemic's unsung heroes. I wonder actually whether we need some more lab photos, and probably lab photos around the world. I think that would be the really interesting thing, because these vaccines, it's no good just making them here. We've got to make them everywhere so that everybody gets them. And I think an international project of looking in those labs where they're developing the manufacturing for all the different versions of the vaccine that we're going to need. I think that would probably be an interesting project to do.
Silke, who would you nominate as your unsung hero for Fran to photograph, or unsung group of people?
Those behind the scenes, those who provide the food for those who are working for the night, the technicians who keep everything going, those who make sure that those at the front can do their job. I think that is really, really important. Don't forget those.
And Andy, who would you nominate?
Well, I certainly agree with the comments about the international theme, because we've got doctors and nurses all over the world who have been there in the front line dealing with participants, putting needles in people's arms, collecting blood samples. People in the lab then, we've got about 200,000 blood samples, all of which had to be packaged up and shipped here to Oxford, and then to various labs all over the world for analysis. All those people are the unsung heroes who've worked night and day for the last 2 years to bring us to this point. But I think actually where we've started with the trial participants, they are the people who've made this vaccine. All of us are just doing our jobs. Those people are the ones who really matter to me.
And my own nomination would be HGV drivers, although possibly they're getting their moment in the sunlight. The challenge, of course, is to identify the unsung heroes while they're still unsung, before everybody suddenly realizes that they're terribly important and we took them for granted all along. Before I turn to Fran and ask whether she's had any new ideas, Andy, we've been talking about unsung heroes. There must have been a moment, this is another question that's come in, there must have been a moment where you felt altogether too much in the spotlight. What was it like to have so many people focusing on you and your colleagues at the vaccine group?
Yes, I mean it's always nice when people are interested in science, and but there's a bit, there can be a bit too much interest, and the difficulty, I think we went through a period of feeling that we wanted to try and communicate the truth of what was happening, and I think that it became very difficult because you realize you cannot control the narrative that's in the media. You know, even if you explain exactly what's happening at a particular moment in the trials, the media will choose one bit of that to turn that into the truth because it gives a headline, and it may not be the most important issue or what you're trying to communicate. And I think for many of us that bit was extremely difficult because, you know, as a scientist you want it to be evidence-based and as close to the truth as possible, but I think once we were able to let go of that and just accept that the media does its thing and you can't correct journalists across the whole of the planet, then I think everyone got a bit more relaxed. But yes, there were certainly moments when it felt like there was enormous pressure, but the pressure was about communication of the truth rather than actually having too much spotlight, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, well, I noticed nobody nominated journalists as unsung heroes. There we go. I'm used to that. We're coming to the end of the hour, so I'm sorry we haven't been able to deal with all the questions, but I wanted to ask Fran whether she had any thoughts for unsung heroes before I hand back to Silke Ackermann. So Fran, you've had all these thoughts.
I was frantically taking notes there for future potential projects. I have long been fascinated by waste, so it's kind of related. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of medical waste, but just waste in general, I feel, is so hidden from society, and I know there are people out there who are sorting out all our waste, and I would love to tell the stories of those people, because without them our society wouldn't function very well at all, and there'd be a lot more disease. So that's my my project to work on, I think. along with some of these ideas that I've been given tonight. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you. And thanks also to Dr. Helen Solstree. Thank you to Professor Sir Andrew Pollard. And thank you to the History of Science Museum for hosting us. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Silke, thank you so much for hosting the event. Thank you for displaying the portraits, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for hosting the event tonight and the conversation. Of course, this event is part of a partnership with Oxford, with Photo Oxford. The photos are visible, Fran's photos are visible, and the rest of the festival will be running until the 15th of November. If you want to find out more about what is going on, please go on the website www.photooxford.org. That leaves it to thank everybody who has taken part in our panel tonight. I know that everybody is incredibly busy, so having you all here, Helen and Fran, Andy and Tim, is a huge privilege for us. And of course, you, the audience, are extremely important to make this an event. Your questions, we have not been able to answer all of those, but there will certainly be other opportunities. So thank you all very much. If you want to support these kind of events, my colleagues are going to put a link in the question and answers if you would like to follow up on that. We are of course delighted by any support that enables us to do these kind of events and tell the story of COVID for future generations, for us to look back to and think, oh yeah, that's the way it was. And those were the unsung heroes. And those, of course, include the journalists. So thank you all very much and goodbye.